Before the United States ever dreamed of manifest destiny, a different superpower ruled the center of the continent. For nearly 2 centuries, the Comanche turned the Great Plains into an empire of their own. An empire without palaces or stone walls, but built on horses, terrifying speed, and a mastery of warfare that broke Spain, bled Mexico, humbled Texas, and forced the United States to adapt or die on its own frontier. Governments signed treaties they could not enforce. Armies marched out and came back shattered. Settlers whispered one word with shaking voices: Comanche. This is the story of the American empire that existed before America could even claim the land beneath its flag. When most people imagine empires, they picture marble capitals, towering fortresses, and armored legions. But on the southern plains, power looked very different. The Comanche Empire was not a loose scattering of camps. It was a hard-edged, expansionist system built on mobility, intelligence, and fear. Its borders were rivers, bison herds, and horizons. Its roads were wind and grass. Its capital was wherever the war bands chose to ride. From the mid-1700s to the late 1800s, the Comanche controlled a vast region known as the Comancheria, territory so dangerous that Spanish officials, Mexican ranchers, Texan rebels, and U.S. officers all learned the same rule: you did not move, trade, or settle there without expecting to pay for it in blood, horses, or tribute. This was not chaos. It was strategy. Raids, alliances, and terror were organized tools of policy. So why is this empire almost invisible in mainstream history? Because acknowledging it shatters the comforting myth that the American frontier was an empty stage waiting for civilization. It forces us to admit that for a long time the United States did not control its own interior, and that it had to study, resist, and eventually copy the very people it tried to erase. If you want to uncover how the Comanche built a hidden superpower in the heart of North America, subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support this work, and comment below telling us from which city you're watching. Because once you understand this empire, you will never see the Wild West the same way again. Long before anyone called them Lords of the Plains, the Comanche were mountain people. Their story begins further north as part of the larger Shoshone world that stretched across the Rocky Mountain region. There, life was defined by high ground, narrow passes, and a constant balancing act between hunting, raiding, and avoiding stronger neighbors. They were already skilled, already tough, but they were not yet the force that would one day make empires flinch. At some point in the late 17th century, that changed. Drawn southward by new opportunities, bison herds, open grasslands, and, crucially, horses, one branch of the Shoshone-speaking peoples began drifting onto the southern plains. This migration was not a single dramatic march, but a series of gradual pushes. Small groups moving into better grazing, following game, testing new territories. Step by step, they left behind the mountains and entered a world where the horizon seemed endless and the sky felt close enough to touch. In that transition, they stopped being just Shoshone. They became something new, the people later known as the Comanche. The southern plains were not empty. Other tribes already hunted, raided, and traveled there. Apache groups, for example, had strong footholds across much of that space. Spanish settlers and missions reached up from the south, while French traders probed down from the north and east. Early Comanche bands had to fight for every piece of ground they claimed. Skirmishes over hunting territory, horse herds, and access to water hardened them quickly. These early conflicts did more than test their strength. They forced the Comanche to rethink how to fight in an environment where speed and visibility mattered more than fortifications. They adapted by embracing the open land instead of fearing it. On the plains, there were no forests to hide in, few mountains to fortify, and nowhere to bottleneck a larger force, only distance, weather, and movement. The Comanche learned to turn these into advantages. They watched how bison moved, how storms rolled across the sky, how rivers cut through the grass, and then built their tactics around those patterns. Battles were no longer about holding ground. They were about choosing when, where, and whether to stand at all. If a fight looked bad, they disappeared. If it looked good, they struck like lightning. As they spread south and east, new warrior bands formed, and older ones evolved. Leadership was not about royal blood or fixed titles, but about proven skill. Who could lead a raid and come back with horses, who could read the land, who could keep people alive. Chiefs and war leaders emerged from reputations built over years of successful decisions, not from inherited crowns. This created a flexible, responsive power structure. If one leader faltered, another could rise. If a band splintered, each piece carried the knowledge to survive and fight independently. It was a system perfectly suited for a people whose strength lay in motion. Gradually, Comanche life reorganized itself around mobility. Camps were designed to move. Possessions were chosen for what they could do and how quickly they could be packed. Children grew up in a world where the ability to ride, track, and travel was as fundamental as knowing how to speak. The horse was not just a tool, it was the center of the social universe. Herds became wealth, status, and insurance against future hardship. Raids to capture more horses were not side activities. They were core economic and military operations. A Comanche band that moved well survived. A band that moved better than anyone else could dominate. This rising mobility drew new alliances and rivalries like iron to a magnet. Some neighboring tribes tried to trade with the Comanche, exchanging goods, captives, and information. Others tried to resist their expansion and paid heavily for it. Apache groups, once dominant in many areas of the southern plains, found themselves pushed, pressured, and eventually displaced by Comanche aggression. At the same time, distant colonial powers, Spain, later Mexico, were forced into a strange relationship with this emerging force. They alternated between trying to make peace, hire the Comanche as allies, and break them through military campaigns, often failing at all three. Out of these shifting interactions, something that looked very much like an empire began to form, even if it bore none of the usual marks. There was no capital city, no single law code, no written constitution. Instead, there were shared patterns, common language and culture binding different bands, coordinated raiding zones, understood spheres of influence, and an expanding sense of Comancheria as a collective domain. The foundations of imperial expansion were not stone and ink, but horse herds, raiding trails, kinship ties, war honors, and the growing awareness among friend and foe alike that this people was no longer just one more tribe on the move. By the time outsiders began to fully register what was happening, the transformation was already well underway. A former mountain offshoot had turned the open plains into its natural element, built leadership structures that rewarded speed and success, and carved out territory through a mixture of pressure, violence, and opportunistic diplomacy. The Comanche had not just migrated, they had reinvented themselves as the core power of a new world. And all of this, every alliance, every early rivalry, every choice to move rather than settle, was setting up the next stage. The moment when horse and rider became a single weapon, and the plains themselves turned into a battlefield no empire knew how to control. The Comanche did not simply adopt the horse, they rebuilt their entire world around it. When horses entered their society, they were not just added to existing traditions like a new tool or weapon. They rewrote what it meant to move, to fight, to hunt, to trade, and to wield power on the plains. The horse revolution did not make the Comanche stronger in a gradual, incremental way. It turned them into something completely different and terrifying. The horse first arrived in the region through Spanish settlements and ranches to the south. Runaway animals, raided herds, and trade leaks spread them northward onto the plains. Many native peoples acquired horses, but for the Comanche, the animal arrived at a critical moment, just as they were shifting from mountain and foothill environments to the wide-open southern plains. They saw, faster and clearer than most, that in this new world, whoever mastered the horse would own time, distance, and survival. So they did not merely ride horses, they made horses the spine of their culture. Their mastery of mounted combat soon became unmatched in North America. Where European-trained cavalry often fought as rigid formations, Comanche warriors moved as individuals within a fluid swarm, each rider able to attack, dodge, and reposition without waiting for shouted orders. They could wheel their mounts at full gallop, loose a volley of arrows, then slip out of range before muskets could reload. Some could hang off the side of a running horse with only one leg over its back, using the animal's body as living armor while shooting from beneath its neck. To outsiders, it looked unreal, a blur of horse and human moving as one organism, fast and lethal. This level of skill started early. Children were put on horseback as soon as they were physically able to stay on. Riding was not a specialized skill reserved for warriors. It was the basic language of daily life. Young boys practiced shooting from ponies, racing one another, learning how to read the moods and limits of their mounts. Girls also rode, herding animals, traveling between camps, and sometimes participating in hunting and other tasks. By the time a Comanche boy reached formal warrior age, he had already spent most of his conscious life on horseback. He did not think about balance, speed, or turning any more than most people think about how to walk. Horse and rider simply moved. Speed became their most decisive strategic weapon. On the plains, where distances were vast and horizons open, the ability to appear somewhere days earlier than anyone expected was as powerful as any fort. Comanche war parties could strike a settlement, steal horses and captives, and disappear into the grasslands before neighboring communities even finished sounding alarms. They could move camps rapidly to follow bison herds, avoid enemy columns, or exploit sudden opportunities. News of raids often arrived after the raiders were already long gone, leaving enemies chasing ghosts and dust. This mobility fed directly into hit-and-run warfare that the Comanche refined to a brutal art. They rarely sought formal stand-up battles against organized infantry or concentrated cavalry. Instead, they attacked where the odds were tilted. Isolated ranches, supply trains, scouting parties, or overconfident troops stretched out along trails. A typical raid might explode out of nowhere, riders splitting to hit multiple targets at once, grabbing horses, killing resistors, then retreating before defenders could mount a coordinated response. If pursued, the Comanche might scatter into multiple groups that later rejoined, or lead their enemies into dead ground where counter-ambushes waited. They chose when fighting happened and when it ended. The psychological impact of these mounted raids was enormous. Frontier settlers lived with the constant knowledge that open space, which looked peaceful and empty, could hide riders just beyond sight. A streak of dust on the horizon could be the wind, or a war party closing the distance far faster than wagon wheels could turn. Children grew up hearing stories of attacks that seemed to materialize from nothing, of riders who could outrun any pursuers, of horses so swift and sure-footed that escape on foot was pointless. Soldiers trained in European-style formations found themselves firing at targets that appeared and vanished before their volleys could land, watching opponents circle them at range like wolves around a pinned herd. Compared with European cavalry, Comanche horsemen played an entirely different game. European cavalry emphasized formation, charge, shock, and occasionally pursuit. It relied heavily on discipline enforced by command structure and often fought in relatively open, predictable patterns. The Comanche treated the horse not as a platform for rigid charges, but as a partner in constant motion. They did not need trumpets to coordinate. They used hand signals, shouts, and shared understanding built from years of small unit raids. They attacked from multiple directions rather than a single axis, preferred encirclement to frontal collision, and viewed any situation where they were locked into a static clash as a failure of planning. European cavalry was impressive on a parade field. Comanche cavalry was optimized for chaos. What made them arguably the greatest horse warriors in history was not just raw skill, but integration. The horse was not a separate branch of their military, it was the military. Every aspect of warfare, from scouting to logistics to retreat, ran through mounted capability. They bred horses for speed and endurance, kept large remount herds, and understood how to manage them across seasons and distances. A Comanche warrior might have several mounts in a single raid, switching to keep them fresh. They knew how far a horse could be pushed before it broke, how much water it needed, and how to read signs of fatigue quicker than most officers could read a map. This total fusion of culture, economy, and war around the horse meant that to challenge the Comanche on their own ground was to challenge the very environment they had mastered. Settler militias, Spanish lancers, Mexican troops, and U.S. cavalry all discovered that numbers and firearms were not enough if their horses were slower, their riders less skilled, and their tactics less suited to the rolling sea of grass under their feet. Again and again, columns were outmaneuvered, outscouted, and outfought by war parties that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. In the end, the horse revolution did more than give the Comanche an advantage. It gave them an identity, a people defined by motion, by horizons, by the ability to strike and vanish with a speed that felt supernatural to their enemies. Their empire was not drawn on maps. It was traced in hoofprints, erased by wind, and remembered in the fear of anyone who watched the plains and wondered what might be riding just beyond the edge of sight. The Comanche understood something that most empires learn only after centuries of war. Terror travels farther than any army. Their raids were not random eruptions of violence. They were messages, delivered at speed, remembered in horror, and designed to echo long after the riders were gone. Comanche raids were often engineered less to hold land permanently than to shape how people thought about that land. A settlement hit once might never recover, not because its walls could not be rebuilt, but because its survivors and their neighbors would never again feel safe there. Ranches were burned, livestock driven off, and select captives taken in ways that left no doubt. This was a warning. Sometimes the Comanche did not need to occupy a region at all. They simply needed others to associate it with pain and loss. Once that association took hold, settlers and rival tribes policed themselves, avoiding key stretches of the Comancheria as if the ground itself were cursed. Brutality was used as psychological warfare, not as uncontrolled rage. There were times when men were killed slowly, bodies mutilated, or survivors allowed to escape with memories vivid enough to haunt entire communities. These acts were calculated. A corpse left in a trail, a scalped body near a water source, or a burned-out homestead with clear signs of struggle, all functioned like written messages. We can reach you. We chose to do this. We can choose again. The point was not just to punish the victim, but to make anyone who saw the aftermath imagine their own family in that place. Over time, their reputation began to arrive before they did. The word Comanche alone carried weight. Spoken around campfires, in frontier forts, in Mexican villages, and in government offices. People who had never seen a Comanche raid in person still made decisions based on what they had heard, rerouting caravans, abandoning marginal settlements, or refusing to travel during certain seasons. This reputation worked like an invisible advance guard. War parties rode into landscapes already softened by rumor, facing enemies whose confidence had been eroded before first contact. Fear made their forces seem larger, nearer, and more relentless than any scout report could verify. The tactics behind this effect were crafted to break morale, not just bodies. Comanche warriors preferred fights that left the enemy feeling helpless, attacks at dawn when defenders were half asleep, night strikes that set animals screaming and structures burning, ambushes that killed leaders first and left groups suddenly leaderless. They aimed at psychology, kill the man giving orders, steal the herd that represents wealth and mobility, take the captives whose loss will be felt every day. A force that survived such an encounter might still be technically intact, but inside it was fractured, trust shaken, nerves raw, sense of security gone. Surprise and speed gave these tactics their force. Comanche riders avoided predictable patterns, They might raid repeatedly in one area, then vanish for months, only to appear hundreds of miles away. They approached from unexpected angles, timed attacks with weather that masked their movement, or used decoys to draw defenders out before hitting from another direction. To defenders, this unpredictability bred dread. If you never knew where or when they would strike, you had to live as if they could strike everywhere, all the time. That kind of constant vigilance is impossible to maintain without breaking. Given this atmosphere, it is no mystery why enemies often fled without fighting. Some frontier communities chose evacuation as strategy. Better to leave than to endure the inevitable raid that everyone whispered was coming. Soldiers sometimes refused to pursue Comanche forces deep into their own territory, knowing they could be led into traps, deprived of water, or harassed into exhaustion. Rival tribes abandoned contested hunting grounds rather than risk becoming the next example. From the Comanche perspective, every retreat like this was a bloodless victory, territory defended or expanded without wasting warriors' lives. Fear, in this sense, was a force multiplier. A relatively small war party could have the impact of a much larger army if its actions were visible, memorable, and talked about. One vicious raid could secure compliance from several nearby settlements. One annihilated patrol could deter future expeditions along that route. The empire extended where people believed it extended. Its reach expanded wherever men sat around fires and said, "We do not go there because the Comanche ride there." This was terror as a calculated imperial tool. It sat alongside trade, negotiation, and occasional alliance-making, not in opposition to them. The same leaders who sent out devastating war parties could sit in councils and talk peace, reminding nervous partners, without needing to say it outright, of what would happen if agreements were broken. Fear gave their words weight. It ensured that promises made to them were less likely to be casually discarded. And when colonial officials drew lines on maps, they had to account not just for rivers and mountains, but for zones where the cost of ignoring Comanche power had already been paid in lives. Of course, there was a price for the Comanche as well. Living by terror meant living with enemies who dreamed of your destruction, who spun your most effective strategies into justification for total war against you. But for a long time, the calculus held, fear kept their riders dominant on the plains, and their name hovering like a storm cloud over the imagination of everyone who dared to cross. For those who heard hooves in the distance, the real question was never just, how many are coming? It was, what message are they bringing this time, and will we live long enough to repeat it? The Comanche did not beat empires by outnumbering them. They beat them by refusing to play the same game. Where Spanish, Mexican, Texan, and American forces marched in neat lines and obeyed written orders, Comanche war parties moved like a living weather system, fluid, adaptive, and almost impossible to pin down. At the heart of their success was decentralized command. There was no single general barking orders through a rigid chain of command. War leaders emerged from reputation and trust. The man who had led successful raids, read the land correctly, and brought people home alive. Once a raid was underway, individual warriors had significant freedom to act within a shared plan. If an opportunity opened, a vulnerable flank, an exposed herd, an isolated group, someone took it without waiting for permission. This flexibility meant that Comanche forces could react faster than any army constrained by strict formations and slow messaging. Their preferred style of fighting was small unit warfare, not massed formation. European-trained troops were used to clear ranks, files and columns, shoulder-to-shoulder volleys, or organized cavalry charges. Comanche bands broke those expectations. They attacked in loose swarms, with riders spreading out, circling and weaving through terrain. Instead of one solid front, enemies faced dozens of tiny battles happening at once. A rider here, two more there, some at longbow range, others darting in close. It was like trying to grapple fog with bare hands. Traditional formations that worked on open fields against similar armies often backfired against this kind of fluid opponent, leaving officers shouting at lines that no longer fit the fight. Terrain and weather were not obstacles, they were weapons. Comanche war parties chose when and where to engage with careful attention to wind direction, visibility, and ground. They used river crossings, ridgelines, and broken terrain to screen their approach, then exploded into open space only at the decisive moment. Storm fronts, dusk, and dawn became tactical tools. A raid launched under gathering thunderclouds or fading light could disorient defenders, mask the sound of hooves, or complicate any attempt at pursuit. Meanwhile, Comanche riders knew exactly how their horses handled mud, heat, or slippery slopes. Enemy troops often found themselves struggling through conditions the Comanche had already factored into their plan. Their weapon mastery reinforced this advantage. On horseback, the composite bow was their signature tool for much of their peak period. It allowed them to fire multiple arrows quickly at full gallop with deadly accuracy. They could shoot forward, sideways, or backward without slowing down, sending volleys into tightly packed infantry or cavalry that could not reload firearms fast enough. Lances extended their reach in close combat, turning speed into penetrating power against both men and mounts. As firearms became more available, the Comanche adapted again. They integrated pistols and later carbines into existing hit-and-run tactics instead of trying to imitate European line shooting. A rider might open with arrows, then switch to a pistol at close range, all while never presenting a stationary target. Feigned retreats and ambushes were classic Comanche plays. A small group might attack, create panic, and then appear to break and run. Pursuing soldiers, believing they had turned the tide, would stretch out in chase, only to be led into ground chosen precisely because it favored the ambushers waiting there. Gullies, bends in rivers, low rises, and patches of scrub became kill zones. From concealed positions, additional Comanche warriors would strike the overextended pursuers from the sides or rear. To officers trained to see retreat as weakness and pursuit as glory, this bait was especially tempting and repeatedly lethal. Communication during raids relied on speed and simplicity. Instead of elaborate, slow-moving signaling systems, Comanche war parties used pre-arranged calls, hand gestures, and the intuitive understanding that comes from years of raiding together. Everyone knew what it meant when a leader pointed with a lance, raised a shield, or gave a certain shout. Because units were small and tightly bonded, information moved fast and rarely needed formal relay chains. Riders could adjust mid-charge based on what they saw, trusting that others were doing the same. This made Comanche forces feel eerily coordinated to outsiders, even without visible orders. Against Spanish forces, the Comanche tested themselves early. Heavy cavalry and infantry backed by lances, sabers, and early firearms looked formidable on paper, but in practice they struggled to hit opponents who refused to stand still. Mexican troops inherited many of the same tactical assumptions and faced the same nightmare. Columns marching out bravely, coming back depleted and demoralized after being harassed, outmaneuvered, or led into losing positions. Texan militias added more aggressive pursuit, but often lacked discipline, making them ideal victims for feigned retreats and carefully prepared traps. Even the U.S. Army, with more resources and organizational capacity, took time to adapt, learning often painfully that numerical superiority and better guns did not automatically translate into victory on the plains. Traditional armies kept failing because they believed war on the plains could be fought like war in Europe or in the forests of the East. They wanted battle lines, decisive engagements, and clear fronts. The Comanche refused all three. They attacked the vulnerable and vanished from strength. They hit supplies instead of forts, scouts instead of main columns, morale instead of fortifications. They understood that on an open landscape, the side that controlled tempo, movement, and fear, not just the side that fired the most bullets, held the real advantage. Time and again, officers wrote reports describing enemies who would not fight fair, who avoided set battles, who struck only from advantage. But from the Comanche perspective, that was precisely the point. Survival was not about honor in formation. It was about making sure your people were still there next season, with enough horses, food, and strength to choose their next move. For anyone marching into their world, the most frightening realization was not just that the Comanche could win a fight, it was that they could choose which fights existed at all. And on a continent rapidly filling with flags, forts, and treaties, that level of control over when war truly began and ended was a kind of power no paper empire could easily match. On most maps of early America, the center of the continent looks like empty space. In reality, that empty zone was one of the most controlled, contested, and intelligently managed regions in North America. The Comancheria, an empire without borders drawn in ink, but very clearly marked in blood, horses, and fear. The Comancheria was not a precise rectangle on a surveyor's chart, but a living territory whose heart lay in what is now western Texas, eastern New Mexico, western Oklahoma, and parts of Kansas and Colorado. Its boundaries shifted over time, but everyone who lived near it understood the basic truth. Inside this vast sea of grass and scrub, the Comanche decided who moved, who traded, who hunted, and who paid for the privilege. It was not enclosed by walls, yet it was one of the most real states on the continent. Control of trade routes was one of the clearest expressions of that power. Trails that connected Spanish New Mexico, Mexican settlements, Texas ranches, and American trading posts all crossed the plains. The Comanche treated these routes as arteries they could constrict or open at will. Caravans that entered their sphere without permission risked losing animals, goods, and men. Those who negotiated or paid tribute gained safer passage, and sometimes even Comanche escort. This meant that silver, textiles, weapons, ammunition, and captives flowing across the interior often did so on terms the Comanche set, not the distant governments that believed they owned the land. Economic domination emerged from a ruthless balance between raiding and exchange. Comanche war parties struck deep into Spanish and later Mexican territory, seizing horses, mules, cattle, and people. These raids were destructive, but they were also the front end of a larger system. Captured livestock expanded Comanche herds, feeding their own people and strengthening their military capacity. Captives could be adopted, ransomed, or traded to other tribes or settlers. Goods taken in raids entered vast informal markets. Comanche bands traded animals, furs, and captives for guns, powder, metal tools, and luxury items. In this way, violence fed commerce, and commerce sustained further violence, a self-reinforcing economy of war. Political influence over neighboring tribes was woven into this structure. Some groups, like certain Apache bands, were pushed out or crushed when they tried to hold key parts of the plains against Comanche expansion. Others learned to coexist by aligning themselves with Comanche power, offering goods, services, or information in exchange for protection, or at least for being left alone. In many cases, peace with the Comanche meant accepting a subordinate role and acknowledging their dominance over shared spaces. Decisions about where to camp, when to move, or whom to trade with were made under the constant shadow of what the Comanche might do in response. Forced alliances and tributary relationships gave the Comanche system a distinctly imperial character. A tribe or settlement that found itself too weak to fight might agree to provide regular gifts, horses, food, or manufactured goods to avoid raids. Spanish and Mexican authorities sometimes entered into uneasy truces, promising rations, trade goods, or even diplomatic recognition in exchange for reduced Comanche pressure. These arrangements were rarely permanent, but they reveal something important. Power often flowed outward from the Comancheria, compelling others to negotiate from a position of fear. Tribute might not be called taxation, but in practice it functioned very similarly. The impact on Spanish and Mexican settlements was profound. Ranches and missions on the northern fringe of New Spain existed under constant threat. Entire districts were periodically depopulated by raids, only to be reluctantly reoccupied later. Local governments struggled to defend distant frontiers against fast-moving war parties that did not behave like conventional armies. Mexican independence did not solve the problem. If anything, it made frontier defenses weaker, creating a vacuum the Comanche exploited. Town councils, governors, and military commanders spent enormous amounts of energy trying to manage a reality they could never fully control, that a nomadic power could reach deep into their claimed territory whenever it chose. All of this was underwritten by a distinct Comanche economy of war. Raiding was not random, it followed rhythms. Timing often aligned with seasonal movements of bison and horses, availability of grass and water, and the condition of rival communities. War parties treated enemy settlements and caravans as sources of capital, livestock, goods, and captives to be harvested and redistributed. The wealth gathered did not accumulate in vaults or stone palaces, but in living assets, herds, tools, weapons, and extended networks of obligation and debt. A successful raid enriched not only the warriors, but the wider bands and households tied to them, reinforcing the social prestige of risk-taking and reinforcing the material base that allowed the Comanche to keep moving and fighting. In this sense, the Comancheria showed how an empire could exist without cities or walls. Its infrastructure was ecological and social rather than architectural. Horse herds as mobile granaries, river systems as trade highways, kinship as bureaucracy, warrior bands as both army and police. Authority flowed through reputation and reciprocal obligation, not written law. Yet from the outside, the effect was unmistakable. Here was a power that collected tribute, controlled trade, dictated movement, and imposed consequences on those who ignored its claims. European-style empires drew straight lines on paper. The Comanche drew curved, shifting lines in the minds of everyone who lived near the plains. Traditional historians often missed this because they were looking for the wrong signs, capitals, monuments, records in government archives. But on the ground, settlers, soldiers, and neighboring tribes knew exactly what they were dealing with. The Comancheria was not a wilderness. It was a governed space, its rules enforced by riders who needed no stone walls to remind anyone where their authority began. For those who approached its edge, the most important border was not marked on any map. It was the invisible line where people lowered their voices and asked the same nervous question: are we in Comanche country now? And if we are, what will it cost us to stay? Comanche power was not just built on horses and war, it was built on a social world that told every person who they were, what they owed, and what they could become. Behind every raid and every battlefield stood an invisible structure of families, leaders, beliefs and expectations that made the Comanche Empire possible. Social structure was anchored in extended family bands rather than rigid classes. People lived in mobile camps organized around kinship, with groups forming, merging and splitting, depending on season, resources and conflict. Authority flowed through respect, not bureaucracy. A person's influence came from what they had done, how many raids they had led, how wise their advice proved, how well they provided for their people, rather than from written titles. This made Comanche society highly adaptable. If one band leader failed or died, others could step forward without collapsing the system. Chiefs and war leaders occupied overlapping but distinct roles. Civil or peace chiefs guided internal matters, mediation of disputes, council decisions, relations between families and long-term alliances. War leaders, by contrast, proved themselves through repeated success in raids and battles. A man might be respected as a war leader without dominating every political decision, and the same person might lead in war but speak as one voice among many in council. Leadership was earned, maintained, and constantly tested. If a war leader made poor choices that cost too many lives or failed to bring back enough horses or captives, support could shift to someone else. Warrior prestige sat at the center of status, but it was not measured only in kills. Raiding, capturing valuable horses, protecting one's band, and demonstrating bravery under fire all elevated a man's reputation. Stories of daring acts, charging under heavy fire, rescuing an ally, outwitting a larger force, circulated through camps and became part of a warrior's identity. Successful warriors might have better access to horses, more influence in councils, and greater attractiveness as marriage partners. Yet prestige also carried expectations. A man with a great name was expected to continue taking risks, to give generously, and to remain dependable under pressure. Treatment of captives reveals both the harshness and complexity of Comanche society. Captives taken in raids might face very different fates depending on age, sex, and circumstance. Some, especially children, were adopted into Comanche families, given new names, and raised as full members of the band. Over time, they could forget their original language and come to see themselves entirely as Comanche. Others were held for ransom, traded, or kept as labor. Some, especially adult men taken in brutal conflicts, could be killed. From the Comanche perspective, adoption was not a sentimental gesture, but a way to recover from losses, increase numbers, and transform outsiders into insiders. To their enemies, however, the knowledge that a lost child might disappear into Comanche life forever added psychological weight to every raid. Women's roles within this mobile empire were far from passive. They managed households, controlled much of the economic life of the camp, processed hides, prepared food, and contributed to the care and management of horse herds. Women could own property, influence marriage alliances, and shape the reputations of their male relatives. In some cases, women took part in raids or defended camps, though this was not the norm. Their labor and decision-making sustained the logistical foundation of war. Without women ensuring that camps functioned, resources were stored, and relationships between families remained stable, the warrior culture would have collapsed under its own weight, instead of projecting strength. Spiritual beliefs tied warfare to a larger cosmic order. Comanche warriors did not see combat as a purely secular activity. Dreams, visions, and personal spirit helpers played roles in how individuals prepared for danger. A warrior might fast, seek guidance through ritual, or carry sacred objects believed to offer protection or luck in battle. Success or failure in raids could be interpreted as signs of spiritual favor or disfavor. This connection between the unseen world and the battlefield gave warriors a sense of purpose beyond immediate survival and made courage something more than stubbornness. It was proof of alignment with forces greater than oneself. Rituals before and after battle reinforced this meaning. Before raids, warriors might gather to paint their bodies and faces, sing specific songs, or perform gestures intended to invoke protection and strength. Particular colors and patterns of paint carried symbolic meaning, signs of readiness to die, calls for spiritual aid, or declarations of identity. After returning, successful war parties often held celebrations and distribution of spoils. Horses, goods, and sometimes captives were shared in ways that reflected contribution, status, and generosity. These rituals did more than mark victory. They taught younger generations what bravery, loyalty, and success looked like in practice. Honor was a driving force running through all of this, but Comanche honor was not a fragile code about standing in fixed lines or refusing tactical retreat. It was about fulfilling obligations, to kin, to one's band, to the dead, and to oneself. A man who refused to fight without cause was not a coward. A man who failed to protect his people when it mattered was. Honor demanded courage in battle, but it also demanded competence, restraint, and the wisdom to choose when not to die needlessly. A war leader who squandered lives for personal glory risked losing face. A warrior who boasted without backing it up risked ridicule. Honor was measured in outcomes as much as intentions. Taken together, Comanche society was not chaos dressed as war. It was a tightly interwoven system where leadership, gender roles, spiritual life, and battlefield behavior supported one another. The empire on horseback existed because campfires were governed, families were organized, stories were told, and values were enforced long before riders ever appeared on a horizon. And as powerful as their horses, weapons, and tactics were, it was this invisible code, who they believed they were and what they believed they owed, that determined how far they were willing to go to remain Comanche in a world closing in around them. The empires came with flags, churches, and paper maps. The Comanche met them with horses, fire, and horizons, and for a long time it was the empires that bent. Spain was the first to truly feel what it meant to collide with Comanche power. From New Mexico and northern New Spain, Spanish officials tried to extend control over the plains with missions, presidios, and cavalry patrols. On paper, they claimed the land. In reality, their reach ended wherever Comanche riders decided it did. Raids cut deep into Spanish territory, striking ranches, missions, and small towns, carrying off horses and captives. Expeditions sent to punish or pacify the Comanche often returned with heavy losses or no decisive victory to report. Spanish authorities alternated between campaigns of force and desperate diplomacy, offering gifts, trade rights, and peace talks in the hope of buying time. They never truly ruled the Comancheria. At best, they learned to live alongside it. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in the early 19th century, it inherited a frontier already under stress and with fewer resources to manage it. Political instability, internal conflicts, and economic weakness made it harder to supply forts, patrol vast distances, or maintain consistent policies. The Comanche sensed that vulnerability. Raids into northern Mexico intensified, devastating ranches and towns in what is now Chihuahua, Coahuila, and other border states. Entire districts were periodically emptied as residents fled repeated attacks. Mexican officials wrote bitterly about a reality they could not change. On the northern frontier, the Comanche acted less like subjects and more like an independent military power that Mexico could not dislodge. Then came Texas, a frontier experiment that quickly learned what it meant to border a horse empire. Anglo-American settlers poured into what was still, in practice, contested ground. They built isolated homesteads, small communities, and later the Republic of Texas itself, often underestimating the Comanche capacity to strike. The result was what many historians now call a Texas frontier collapse. Line after line of settlement pushed too far, too fast, and then shattered under intense raiding. Forts were burned, families killed or taken captive, livestock herds driven off almost overnight. Texan militias could win brutal small battles or launch vengeful campaigns, but they struggled to stop the pattern. On the map, Texas claimed land. On the ground, vast sections of that land belonged to whoever rode fastest. When the United States absorbed Texas and pushed its own expansion westward, it assumed its larger population, stronger economy, and professional army would solve what previous regimes could not. Instead, U.S. forces ran into the same problem. A mobile enemy that refused to behave like European armies. Columns sent into the Comancheria found themselves harassed, starved, or led in circles. Forts became islands of control in an ocean the army did not truly command. Generals could win decisive engagements here and there, but those victories rarely translated into lasting control of the plains. For decades, the Comanche remained a factor that American policymakers had to plan around, not simply a tribal problem to erase with one campaign. Treaties became a repeating cycle of hope and failure. Spanish, Mexican, Texan, and American officials all tried to use agreements to tame the frontier, promising peace, trade, rations, or defined borders in exchange for reduced raiding. Some Comanche leaders signed when it aligned with their interests, securing goods, buying time, or easing pressure in one direction so they could focus power elsewhere. But treaties were made between governments that did not fully control their own people, and a decentralized power that did not recognize European ideas of fixed permanent borders. Broken promises, Unauthorized settler expansion and internal disagreements on both sides turned many treaties into dead letters. Each collapse fed more mistrust and more violence. Along the way, there were famous battles and massacres that burned themselves into memory on all sides. Frontier communities remembered sudden attacks that wiped out families and entire camps. Comanche oral history preserved stories of treacherous meetings, ambushes masquerading as peace talks, and punitive expeditions that targeted women, children, and elders. Clashes like the Council House fight in San Antonio or later U.S. Campaigns on the plains showed how easily negotiation could turn to bloodshed. Each incident hardened attitudes, turning what might have been negotiated coexistence into long cycles of revenge. What united all these imperial experiences, Spanish, Mexican, Texan, American, was a common frustration: the inability of governments to fully control the plains. Administrators in distant capitals could draw boundaries and pass laws, but on the ground, those directives often meant little once a column left the last fort. Supply lines were fragile. Weather and distance punished poorly planned operations. A single Comanche raid could undo months of political work by shattering the sense of security necessary for settlement. Power resided not in who owned the most paper, but in who could move, see, and strike fastest across that vast space. In this context, the Comanche were not a minor obstacle. They were an equal and at times a superior power. They dictated terms over enormous stretches of land, forced major states to adjust their strategies, and compelled stronger economies to pour resources into a frontier they never truly mastered until the late 19th century. For long periods, the question for each regime was not how do we rule them, but how do we avoid provoking them into a war we cannot win? To understand that era honestly is to accept a simple, unsettling fact. For generations, the heart of what would become the United States was not under American or European control. It belonged to a people on horseback whose decisions could make empires hesitate, retreat, or bleed out on the open grass. The Comanche Empire did not fall because it was outthought on the battlefield. It fell because the world around it was deliberately shattered, its people weakened by disease, its food supply destroyed, and its way of life methodically targeted until even the best horse warriors on earth could no longer outrun history. Long before the last cavalry charges and reservation treaties, smallpox and other diseases had already cut into Comanche strength. Epidemics moved faster than riders, moving along trade routes and contact networks, striking bands that might never have seen a white soldier up close. A disease like smallpox did not care how fast you could ride or how well you could shoot from a gallop. It killed warriors, children, and elders alike, hollowing out the population that sustained raids, herding, and decision-making. Survivors carried scars, not only on their bodies, but in their social fabric. Broken families, lost knowledge, weakened camps that could not move or fight with the same confidence. Then came the destruction of the buffalo herds, the true breaking point. For generations, bison had been the Comanche's moving foundation. Food, clothing, shelter materials, trade goods, and spiritual connection, all in one vast, roaming resource. Once U.S. policy and commercial hunters turned systematic slaughter into strategy. Entire herds began to disappear at a scale never seen before. Railroads brought hunters deep into the plains. Piles of bones and rotting carcasses replaced what had once been the beating heart of Comanche economic and spiritual life. Without the buffalo, even the best horse culture in the world could not feed itself in the same way. Starvation became a weapon of war. U.S. military planners understood that chasing Comanche bands in endless circles was costly and uncertain. But if they could strip away food and mobility, they could force outcomes that bullets alone had failed to achieve. Destroying buffalo, burning camps and stores, targeting horse herds, and disrupting seasonal movements slowly squeezed the empire. Comanche bands faced winters with less meat, fewer hides, and weaker animals. Hunger undermined morale as surely as defeat in battle. People who had once ridden out proudly now had to weigh every raid against the risk of leaving families underfed and exposed. Relentless military campaigns added direct pressure to this slow strangulation. US forces, learning from earlier failures, began to adapt tactics. Winter campaigns against villages when horses were weaker, coordinated drives that tried to trap mobile bands, and constant pursuit designed to deny rest and recovery. Forts multiplied across the plains, creating a net of garrisons and supply lines that slowly shrank the spaces where Comanche could move freely. Individual battles might still showcase Comanche skill and courage, but the strategic picture shifted. Now they were fighting not just armies, but time, hunger, and industrial-scale resource extraction. Breaking the Comanche economy was the key. Raiding had once turned enemy settlements, ranches, and caravans into renewable sources of wealth: horses, cattle, captives, and trade items. But as buffalo vanished, as settlements fortified and multiplied, and as military escorts and patrols expanded, the cost-benefit equation changed. Raids brought harsher retaliation. Targets became more heavily defended. Trading networks shifted toward US-controlled posts and rail towns. Comanche bands increasingly found themselves negotiating for rations, supplies, and limited rights in a system they no longer controlled. The empire of war and horses was being replaced by an empire of paperwork and ration lines. Forced relocations and reservations completed the process. Once starvation and constant pressure had done their work, US authorities could present peace on terms that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. Surrender of weapons, settlement on restricted lands, acceptance of rations, and submission to new legal systems. The Comanche, like many other nations, faced impossible choices: continue fighting and risk annihilation of their families by hunger and overwhelming force, or move on to reservations where survival meant living under foreign rules. Many war leaders who had defined their lives by freedom on the plains ended their days in cramped spaces, watching children grow up without the buffalo and horizons that had once defined their people. With the reservation era came the collapse of mounted warfare dominance. Horses still mattered, but barbed wire, railroads, telegraphs, and repeating rifles had changed the landscape. The open plains were being carved into fenced properties, patrolled not just by cavalry, but by lawmen and settlers. Large-scale mounted raids became nearly impossible under constant surveillance and the threat of rapid military response. The skills that had once made Comanche warriors invincible on their own ground could no longer overcome a system designed to limit movement in every direction. The end of imperial independence did not mean the end of the Comanche people, but it did close the chapter in which they could dictate terms to surrounding powers. The Comancheria, once a living, shifting space defined by hoofbeats and war trails, was absorbed into states and counties, its borders erased from maps and memory. Official histories framed this as the inevitable advance of civilization, quietly skipping over the fact that it took disease, ecological devastation, and relentless, often brutal policy to break a society that conventional warfare alone had failed to defeat. Yet even in defeat, the story of how the Comanche Empire fell raises a deeper question. What does it mean when a superpower can only be conquered after its world is systematically destroyed from beneath its feet, rather than beaten head-on in the field? The Comanche Empire did not vanish. It changed shape. Even after the horse herds were broken and the Comancheria carved into states and ranches, its imprint stayed in bloodlines, landscapes, and the very myths America tells about itself. The genetic and cultural legacy of the Comanche runs quietly through modern America. Descendants live not only within the recognized Comanche nation, but scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and beyond, sometimes knowing their ancestry, sometimes discovering it generations later. Family stories, surnames, and DNA tests trace back to a time when Comanche bands adopted captives, intermarried with neighboring tribes, and mixed with Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo populations. Languages may have faded in some families, But habits, place names, and remembered warnings about certain lands linger. The empire's people did not disappear. They became threads in the fabric of a country that once tried to break them. Their influence on cowboy and cavalry tactics is one of the most understated parts of that legacy. Many of the riding skills later associated with the American cowboy, fast remount changes, deep seat riding, handling large herds over open country, evolved in constant contact and conflict with Comanche practices. U.S. cavalry officers who fought on the plains studied Comanche mobility, scouting, and hit-and-run techniques, then adjusted their own doctrine. The idea that mounted troops needed to think like raiders, not just parade ground cavalry, came directly from hard lessons learned against Comanche war parties. In a silent way, the people the United States fought taught it how to move across its own interior. The Comanche also reshaped U.S. expansion by forcing delay, adaptation, and compromise. For decades, plans drawn up in Washington or Mexico City had to be revised around the reality that certain corridors were simply too dangerous or too costly to hold. Railroads, forts, and major trails were chosen and defended with Comanche power in mind. Some regions were settled later than others, not because they were less desirable, but because they lay in the heart of the Comancheria. The timeline of manifest destiny is not a straight, triumphant line. It is a path bent around a mobile empire that made the United States earn every mile it took. Rewriting the myth of the Wild West requires putting the Comanche and other native powers back at the center of the story. Popular culture usually frames the West as a struggle between settlers, outlaws, and U.S. lawmen, with native people as background threats or tragic victims. In reality, for a large part of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Comanche were not background. They were the main obstacle, the main negotiators, and often the main military power on the southern plains. Recognizing that flips the narrative. The wildness of the West was not an empty chaos, but the result of clashing systems of order, imperial, settler, and Comanche, fighting over who would define the rules. Archaeological work and historical scholarship are slowly catching up to this reality. Excavations at old campsites, battlefields, and trading locations, combined with re-examined documents and indigenous oral histories, reveal a more complex picture of Comanche life. Trade hubs where raided goods flowed, mixed communities, long-distance networks of alliance and enmity. Historians now speak of the Comancheria as a true political and economic system, not just a raiding zone. Nibru, this re-evaluation challenges older histories that treated the Comanche as a temporary disturbance on the way to an inevitable American future. Fear played a major role in erasing their recognition. Because Comanche power expressed itself through terror, mobility, and constant pressure, later storytellers had an easy excuse to flatten them into villains. It is much simpler and more comforting to say that the U.S. conquered savage raiders than to admit it spent generations negotiating with, losing to, and finally dismantling a formidable native superpower. The very tactics that kept Comanche people alive, hit-and-run warfare, harsh reprisals, refusal to submit, were used as moral justification to write them out of the story or depict them only as obstacles to progress. Despite this, the modern Comanche nation endures. Centered largely in Oklahoma today, Comanche people maintain government structures, cultural programs, language revitalization efforts, and ceremonies that carry forward their identity in a completely changed world. Veterans, artists, activists, and educators from the nation speak openly about both the pride and the trauma of their history. Pride in being descended from some of the most skilled horse warriors on the continent, trauma from boarding schools, land loss, and the long legal and cultural pressures to assimilate. Survival now is not about outmaneuvering cavalry. It is about protecting language, rights, and memory in a society that still often prefers a simplified past. The Comanche Empire still matters today because it forces a rethinking of what power looked like in North America before fences and highways. It shows that a people without stone cities or written laws can nonetheless build an empire that rewrites the plans of global powers. It exposes how fear can be both a weapon of survival and a tool of erasure, used first by the Comanche to protect their world, and later by their conquerors to justify its destruction. And it challenges the idea that the United States rose in a vacuum, reminding us that its institutions, tactics, and even myths were partly forged in struggle against nations it preferred to forget. To understand that is to see the plains differently, not as a blank backdrop for cowboy legends, but as the former core of a native superpower whose echoes still shape the country riding over its buried tracks. For most of American history, the Comanche were treated like background noise. Dangerous, yes, but ultimately just another obstacle on the way to the frontier myth. In reality, they were a dominant superpower that controlled the center of the continent without walls, capitals, or written borders. Through intelligence, mobility, and a ruthless understanding of fear, they forced Spain, Mexico, Texas, and the United States to adapt to them, not the other way around. For generations, no empire could simply march across the southern plains and assume victory. It had to negotiate, reroute, or bleed. Understanding their story forces a harder truth. America was not born unconquered. It became what it is by surviving and eventually destroying a native empire that had already mastered the heartland. The tactics U.S. forces later used across the West were shaped in direct response to Comanche power. To ignore that is to accept a comfortable myth instead of a complicated reality. If you want more stories that strip away those myths and expose the real power struggles behind the Wild West, subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support this work, and comment below telling us from which city you're watching. Once you've seen the frontier through Comanche eyes, the old legend of an empty, uncontested West will never feel the same again.